To this now, the SACP condemns alleged racism and racial prejudice against Africans fleeing the Ukraine. The party has added its voice to concerns that white people are being given priority in evacuations. SACP spokesperson Alex Mashilo joins us for more on this. Mr. Mashilo, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, this whole Russia conversation, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's almost difficult a subject to unpack right now. And that's purely because some say there's no time to be theorizing or philosophizing while people are dying. A nuanced conversation on who is the real aggressor could have been had with Russia, but the fact is now they've invaded. You can no longer, or they've lost that privilege to be given an ear as to what exactly has happened, and there are concerns around NATO's eastward expansion, if you will. Do you share those sentiments that perhaps they no longer deserve the privilege to be heard on their concerns?
Just kindly repeat the question. Who does no longer deserve to heard their concerns?
Russia in particular, that here we are. In this instance, they made threats, and some were saying, I've even listened to one of the SACP members speaking about this, that they had raised concerns about NATO's expansion eastward, that this for them was a legitimate concern, but citizens are now saying they've lost possibly the privilege because they've gone on to invade. There's no longer time to engage them, but it's time to condemn because they are in Ukraine now. What is the SACP's position on this? Should they still be heard on their security concerns?
Yes, no, you are dealing with a complex situation in Ukraine. And if you take sides in that situation, like we have seen in parts of the South African media and population, there is no way you can ever resolve that situation. You need to look at that situation in its historical context. It is true that NATO, which is an instrument of war, by the way, has been expanding eastwards in Eastern Europe. So when an instrument of war is expanding towards you, clearly you have legitimate concerns about that. Why in the first instance would an instrument of war that is known to have destroyed so many countries, look at Libya in Africa, look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at Afghanistan, look at the massive destructions caused by NATO. It will be unreasonable to say when that instrument of war is expanding towards you, you should have your legitimate concerns about its war activities not heard. That will not even help resolve that situation. And again, although the situation in Ukraine has a long history, we all should know that there was a coup in 2014. That coup was backed by NATO. Following that coup, the regime that took over actually violated the human rights of citizens, which is why when you talk about citizens in that context, it cannot be that citizens have the same view. Citizens have different and even contradictory views in that area. So it will depend on which side of the citizens you stand. As the SACP, we refuse to take sides. For example, that regime banned the Communist Party of Ukraine, banned all communist symbols. It adopted the so-called decommunization laws. It shelled the eastern region, Donetsk and Luhansk, unleashing atrocities. And in those areas, we all know that the majority of the populations are Russian-speaking population. It's a problem. However, having said this, as the SACP, we want to make our position quite clear. We believe that all parties involved in that situation, starting with NATO, which is the principal aggressor, and the regime in Ukraine, which must be held accountable for its human rights violations and atrocities against the people. And also Russia, all these forces have to de-escalate the military conflict and revert to seeking peaceful ways of resolving the dispute. That is our position. And it is a categorical position.
Okay, I hear you that you're saying NATO is the principal aggressor now. Do you not think that world leaders missed the opportunity then to have that nuanced conversation before an invasion? Because I remember China said that, yes, if there must be a ceasefire, people need to talk, but at the very least, there also needs to be the addressing of their concerns that here it seems that NATO is expanding eastward. Do you think that that opportunity was missed before this?
No, the opportunity was not missed. It was undermined by NATO. Those people have nuclear weapons. They have weapons of mass destruction. They are talking about the United States. So systematically, you are talking about a regime that has been undermining other people. And in the process, it generated the reaction by Russia. We need not run away from that. But having said that, we must stand in one voice and say we don't want war. And in saying this, because there is some propaganda, you see globally what is happening now, media diversity is suppressed. For example, you had RT removed from countries such as South Africa via channels in Europe, so that populations can be bombarded with propaganda generated by the United States and its allies and transmitted by uncritical domestic media agents. So as the SACP, we would not like to fall into the agendas of those forces.
And here at eNCA, we're also giving you that opportunity to give us your views, because we want that nuanced debate, or we want that multiplicity of voices. You are best placed as communists to give us insight on some of these matters. Can I just get clarity on this? Was there in fact a promise?
Can I, just before you proceed, we would like you to thank you for this opportunity. You are doing a good work, right? Unlike those who shut down channels, so that it is only their channels that transmit information, and that information is biased. So unlike them, you are taking a different stance, and we wish to thank you for that.
All right. No, it's much appreciated. Now, can I get clarity on this one? Was there in fact a promise by NATO, though, that there would never be an expansion eastward? Because from the research that we've done, it seems that there was an assumption by Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and even when, in particular, the unraveling of the Warsaw Pact, that Russia assumed that this would signal a new era when NATO would see there was no threat anymore because the East Bloc was no longer organized. So there would be no need for NATO to expand. Was there, in fact, some sort of an agreement, or it was just an assumption by the East that NATO will never come to our side?
In the first place, NATO is an imperialist instrument of war. It's a military formation. It must not even expand to start with. So as a matter of fact, there was commitment documented to the previous president of the last president in Russia, from the USS to the current Russia, Gorbachev, and foreign minister, that they will not be expanding. What they did thereafter was to engage in a military buildup in Eastern Europe. And we're talking about military buildup in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, in the seas and oceans around Russia. They have been surrounding Russia. And the US emphasized back coup to replace Ukraine democratically elected president in 2014 was part of their expansion. And as part of that expansion, they banned the Communist Party of Ukraine and started bombarding the eastern regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. This is part of NATO, and NATO was active in that. There was an agreement called the Minsk Agreement, in which the Ukrainian regime agreed to allow Luhansk and Donetsk greater autonomy. It turned around because it is functioning under the yoke of NATO. Just imagine, you are a South African. What will you think when an instrument of war like NATO is expanding towards you? That is an act of war, because war does not begin the day you hear the sound of bombardment. War begins with minute preparations during peace times. But when it unfolds in that way, it still remains an act of war. It is an act of war. It is a war of position. When you have been surrounded in a military expansion as a country, you can see that this is unwelcome. It has to stop. So that's the situation you are dealing with in Ukraine. And Over
So,
and
Mr.
above
Mashilo,
that,
we've
as
run
I
out of
said,
time,
and I wish to
unfortunately. We've
emphasize
run
this
out of time. I really apologize. A very insightful conversation. So I take it that you are in agreement with South Africa's position to abstain from that vote because there needed to be some sort of nuanced conversation. I take it that's your position, that you are in agreement with the country.
Now, South Africa did very well by not taking sides. You see, those people who are supporting the U.S. and its natural allies want South Africa not just to vote, but to vote in
Mr.
favor
Mashilo,
of their imperialist agenda.
thank you very much.
South Africa did very well by rejecting them.
All right. Thank you very much for your indulgence. That's Alex Mashilo from the South African Communist Party, just giving us their views on the current Russia invasion in Ukraine.